The winter of 1887 came down on the high valleys of the territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of frost that gilded the edges of the world. It was a declaration of war. The cold did not knock before it entered. It broke down the door. It seeped through the chinking of the log cabins, a thief in the night stealing warmth from sleeping children. It crept across the floorboards, a predator stalking the hearth. The wind was its accomplice, a shrieking accomplice that tested every nail, every joint, every conviction a man had in his own two hands. For the people of the settlement, nestled in a crease of the unforgiving mountains, this was the known enemy. Winter was a siege, and their cabins were the fortresses. Every autumn was a frantic preparation for this siege. Wood was cut, split, and stacked in cords that rose like wooden ramparts against the coming cold. Food was salted, smoked, and sealed in root cellars. But the greatest battle, the one that consumed their strength and their thoughts, was not against the cold itself, but against its heaviest weapon, the snow. The snow in that part of the world was not the gentle powder of storybooks. It was a substance of immense weight and cunning. It fell for days without ceasing, a quiet, relentless accumulation that buried fences and transformed the known landscape into a soft, white, and treacherous mystery. It piled on the roofs of their cabins, and this was where the true danger lay. A foot of snow was a burden. 2 feet was a strain. 3 feet was a threat. 4 feet was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The traditional way to fight this weight was with brute force. The roofs were built steep, with heavy timber beams, designed in theory to shed the load. But the snow was clever. It would melt slightly under the midday sun, even in the deepest cold, and then freeze again as darkness fell, creating a stubborn layer of ice that glued the subsequent snowfalls to the shingles. The weight would build, compacting into a dense, immovable slab. The only answer was to climb onto the groaning roofs with wide wooden shovels and break the mountains back, one shovelful at a time. It was perilous work, a dance on a slippery, angled ledge with a blizzard for a partner. Men fell, roofs collapsed. Every family had a story of a near miss, and the community graveyard held the stories of those who were not so lucky. The memory of the old Henderson barn, which had collapsed 2 winters prior, its ridgepole snapping with a sound like a cannon shot and burying 3 prize cattle, was a ghost that haunted their preparations. They were a people who trusted tradition, because tradition was what had allowed them to survive this long. They built as their fathers had built, with thick logs, notched tight, and heavy raftered roofs pitched at the angle their grandfathers had decreed was best. They faced the winter with the same grim determination, the same tools, and the same prayers. They knew the winter would be hard, and they believed they knew the only way to endure it. Their knowledge was a fortress built of habit, and they saw no reason to look beyond its walls. They were a community bound by a shared struggle, a shared understanding of how the world worked. And in that shared understanding, there was little room for anything new. Into this world of rigid certainty lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, her husband taken by a logging accident 2 summers before, leaving her with 2 small children and a cabin at the edge of the settlement. She was quiet, observant, and largely invisible to the men who made the decisions in the valley. They saw her as a fragile thing, a problem to be managed with charity and pity. They offered to reinforce her roof, to chop her wood, to do the heavy work a woman alone could not be expected to do. They were good men, in their way, but their kindness was laced with a condescending certainty. They believed they knew what she needed better than she did. Ilara, however, possessed a different kind of knowledge. Her husband had been a builder, a man of tradition like all the others. But her father, back in the old country, had been an engineer, a man who believed in principles over habits. He had filled his letters to her not with family gossip, but with sketches of sluice gates, diagrams of trusses, and theories on load-bearing dynamics. He wrote of how a Roman arch distributed weight, how a buttress supported a wall, how different materials responded to pressure and temperature. She had kept every letter, every drawing. After her husband's death, in the long, quiet evenings, she read them not as memories of her father, but as textbooks for her own survival. She did not see the world as a set of unchanging rules, but as a collection of forces, pressure, temperature, weight, and friction, that could be understood and, perhaps, redirected. She had watched the men on the roofs. She had felt the deep, bone-aching cold in her own cabin. She had seen how the snow clung to the shingles like a desperate hand. And she had an idea. It was an idea born from one of her father's letters, a letter that spoke of thermal mass and the subtle power of insulation. It was an idea so contrary to the local wisdom that she knew, even as it formed in her mind, that it would be seen as madness. She was not going to fight the weight of the snow with stronger timbers. She was not going to fight it with a steeper pitch. She was going to fight it with a layer of dirt. The idea was simple in its principle, yet radical in its application. She would build a new roof, but beneath the final layer, she would pack a dense mixture of soil, clay, and fine gravel, nearly a foot thick. This earthen layer, she reasoned, would act as a massive insulator. The meager heat rising from her small hearth, heat that was normally lost to the winter air, would be trapped in the soil. It would warm the earth, not enough to feel with a hand, but just enough to keep the surface of the roof a fraction of a degree above freezing. This tiny temperature difference, this imperceptible warmth, would prevent the first layer of snow from bonding into ice. It would create a microscopic layer of meltwater, a lubricant. And when the snow accumulated to a sufficient weight, it would simply slide off under its own mass, cleanly and completely. She would add weight to defeat weight. She would use the earth to command the sky. When she began the work in the late summer, the community noticed. At first, it was with mild curiosity. They saw her tearing the old shingles from her roof, exposing the rafters. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose hands were as thick and calloused as oak bark, stopped by her property. He was a large man, accustomed to being heard, his voice a low rumble of authority. "That's heavy work for you, Elara," he said, his tone a mixture of concern and disapproval. "My boys and I can have this shingled for you in a day. You've only to ask." "Thank you, Silas," she replied, her voice steady as she pried another shingle loose. "But I have a different plan for this roof." Her plan became apparent over the next week, and curiosity curdled into disbelief, then outright mockery. She hauled buckets of soil from the riverbank, sifting it through a screen. She mixed it with clay she dug from the hillside, and fine gravel she gathered from the creek bed. The men would watch her from the track that led to the lumber camp, their conversations pausing as they saw her toiling with her wheelbarrow. The first whispers started in the general store. "The widow's lost her senses," one would say. "Grief does strange things to a person." Silas came again, this time with two other senior men from the settlement. He saw the strange, thick underlayment she had put down, layers of tarred canvas and birch bark, and the growing pile of prepared earth. His face, usually a mask of stoic competence, was clouded with genuine alarm. "Elara, what is this foolishness?" he demanded, his voice stripped of its earlier kindness. "You're putting dirt on your roof? You're inviting the damp in, the rot. You're building your own tomb, and a tomb for those children." "It will be dry, Silas," she said calmly, not stopping her work. The layers beneath will keep the moisture out." "It's the weight," he exclaimed, gesturing with a frustrated sweep of his arm. "A good roof is as light as it can be while still being strong. You're piling a mountain on top of your own head before the first snowflake even falls. The first heavy snow, and this whole structure will come down on you. It's dangerous. It's madness." The other men murmured in agreement. They saw a grieving woman engaged in a project of profound and tragic ignorance. The laughter started then. It wasn't cruel, not at first. It was the baffled laughter of men who see something so far outside their experience that they cannot process it as anything other than a joke. But as the days turned into weeks and her earthen roof began to take shape, the laughter gained an edge of derision. She became a local spectacle. "Going to plant potatoes up there, Ilara?" they would call out. "Hope you have a strong back for harvesting." The women would watch her from their windows, shaking their heads and whispering prayers for her and her poor, motherless children. She was utterly alone, an island of strange, silent labor in a sea of communal disapproval. Ilara did not argue. She did not explain. She knew that her father's diagrams and theories would mean nothing to them. Their knowledge was written in wood and sweat, not on paper with ink. Her proof would not be in words, but in the performance of the roof itself. And so, she worked. The sun of the late summer beat down on her, and she pushed the wheelbarrow, her muscles screaming in protest. The autumn winds began to blow, cold and sharp, and she was on the roof, spreading the mixture with a trowel, packing it down, ensuring its density was uniform across the entire surface. Her labor was a slow, methodical ritual. Each day, she rose before the sun, her first task to check on her children, who slept peacefully, unaware of the controversy their mother was building over their heads. Then she would go out into the crisp morning air and begin. The work was physically grueling, beyond anything she had ever done. Hauling the earth was a battle against gravity. Mixing it was a thick, stubborn wrestling match. Getting it onto the roof was a feat of leverage and sheer willpower, bucket by painful bucket. Her hands, once soft, became a roadmap of calluses, blisters, and cuts. Her back ached with a fire that never fully went out. She was a study in patient precision. She remembered her father's letters, which stressed that the success of any design was in the details of its execution. The pitch of the roof had to be exact, steep enough to encourage the slide, but shallow enough to hold the earthen layer in place without it slumping. She had spent 2 full days adjusting the rafters with a block and tackle, measuring the angle with a weighted string and a protractor her father had sent her years ago. The community saw this as more evidence of her folly, a woman tinkering with things she could not possibly understand. The composition of the soil was her next obsession. It could not be simple dirt, which would turn to mud and then to ice. It needed to be a carefully balanced aggregate. The clay provided cohesion, a binder to hold it all together. The sand and fine gravel allowed for drainage, preventing it from becoming waterlogged. The dark, loamy soil was there to absorb and retain the sun's warmth. She spent days testing small batches, letting them dry in the sun, pouring water on them, seeing how they behaved. The men who passed by saw a woman playing in the mud, a pathetic and sorrowful sight. They did not see the meticulous science of it, the careful, iterative process of a born engineer. While she toiled in her isolation, the rest of the settlement was a hive of conventional activity. Silas and his crew were in high demand. They moved from cabin to cabin, their work a noisy, confident spectacle of hammering and sawing. They were reinforcing roofs the way they always had, adding thick new collar ties, sistering cracked rafters with fresh timber, and nailing down new layers of shingles. Their work was visible, understandable, and reassuring to the community. It looked strong. It felt safe. Every nail driven was an act of communal defiance against the coming winter. When they finished a job, they would stand back, admire their handiwork, and cast a pitying glance toward the strange, brown-roofed cabin at the edge of the settlement. Their work was finished in days, hers stretched on for weeks. Theirs was a proclamation of strength. Hers was a silent, patient prayer offered to principles they could not comprehend. By the time the first frost came, her roof was done. It did not look like a roof. It looked as if a patch of the forest floor had been lifted and draped over her home. It was covered with a final layer of thick sod, the grass already turning brown with the season. It looked heavy, alien, and profoundly wrong to the eyes of the settlers. It looked, as one man put it, like a grave mound. Her isolation was now complete. The offers of help had long since ceased, replaced by a wall of silence and shaking heads. She was the foolish widow, the woman who had built her own disaster. They were simply waiting for the winter to prove them right. The first snows were light, a gentle dusting that did nothing to test her creation. But then, in the second week of December, the sky turned a flat, ominous gray. The air grew still and heavy, and a profound silence fell over the valley. The old-timers felt it in their bones. This was not a passing squall. This was the arrival of the great storm, the kind of blizzard that would be spoken of for generations. It began in the afternoon, with flakes so large and dense they seemed to suck the very light from the sky. Within an hour, the world was a churning cauldron of white. The wind began to howl, a low moan that rose to a piercing shriek. It drove the snow sideways, piling it into immense drifts, erasing roads and paths, isolating every cabin in a sudden, suffocating wilderness. For 2 days and 2 nights, it did not stop. The snow fell with a relentless fury, a suffocating blanket being laid over the world. Inside their cabins, the families huddled close to their fires. The familiar sounds of the settlement, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the lowing of cattle, were gone, swallowed by the roaring of the wind and the hiss of the snow against the window panes. The true test had begun. The weight on the roofs began to accumulate at an alarming rate. This was not the light powder of early winter. It was a heavy, wet snow, each flake laden with moisture. It packed down, creating a slab of immense density. On the second night, the sounds began. A low groan from the timbers, a sharp crack that sent a jolt of fear through the heart of a family. The men knew the signs. The roofs were failing. The traditional methods, the heavy beams and the steep pitches, were being defeated. The weight was too great, the accumulation too fast. In the heart of the blizzard, a desperate and deadly ritual began. Men, bundled to their eyes, tethered by ropes held by their terrified wives, climbed onto their roofs. They fought against the screaming wind and the blinding snow, their shovels making a desperate, scraping sound. It was a hopeless battle. For every shovelful they threw into the gale, another seemed to land in its place. The cold was brutal, a physical force that stole the breath and froze the skin. Frostbite was a certainty, death a distinct possibility. Silas was on the roof of his own home, the largest and supposedly strongest in the settlement. He felt the rafters beneath his feet tremble and sag. The great central beam, a piece of old-growth oak he had selected himself, was emitting a terrifying, splintering groan. He worked with a frantic energy born of pure fear, his lungs burning, his arms leaden. He looked out across the maelstrom, a landscape of pure, violent white, and his eyes fell upon the dark shape at the edge of the settlement, Ilara's cabin. He expected to see a crater, a pile of rubble where her foolish experiment had collapsed. But the cabin was still standing. It was a dark, unmoving shape against the chaos, almost serene. He could not understand it. He assumed the snow had simply not yet reached its breaking point. He turned back to his own desperate work, his heart a cold knot of dread. Inside Ilara's cabin there was no fear. There was only warmth and a profound quiet. The thick, earthen roof was a masterful sound insulator, reducing the shriek of the blizzard to a distant, muffled whisper. The children slept in their beds, warm and undisturbed. Ilara sat by her small, efficient hearth, mending a sock. She was not burning through her woodpile at a frantic rate like her neighbors. The insulation above her was so effective that a small fire kept the entire cabin at a comfortable, even temperature. She was not ignorant of the storm raging outside. She was simply at peace within it. She had trusted the principles. She had done the work. Now, she was just waiting. Late on the second night, she heard it. It was not the sharp crack of failing timber. It was a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the bones of the house itself. It was followed by a tremendous, muffled whoosh. The cabin shuddered slightly, a brief, gentle tremor. One of the children stirred in his sleep but did not wake. Ilara smiled. She walked to the window and scraped a small viewing hole in the thick frost. She could see nothing but the swirling snow, but she knew what had happened. The weight had reached the critical point. The microscopic layer of meltwater had done its job. The great, heavy slab of snow had broken its bond with the roof and slid cleanly away. Her roof was clear. Her theory was no longer a theory. It was a fact. An hour later, as the snow continued to pile up, it happened again. The same deep rumble, the same satisfying whoosh. The system worked. It worked perfectly. The storm raged for another full day before it finally broke. The dawn of the fourth day revealed a world transformed, a landscape of monstrous white shapes under a piercingly blue, silent sky. The settlement was buried. Snow was drifted up to the eaves of the cabins. The silence was absolute, broken only by the exhausted, pained sounds of men continuing their fight with the snow. The roofs that had survived were sagging visibly, their ridgepoles bowed like the backs of old men. The roof of the community hall had a great, gaping hole in it. 2 smaller sheds had been completely flattened. The contrast between Ilara's home and the rest of the settlement was stark and undeniable. Around every other cabin, the snow was piled high against the walls, a suffocating siege. But around her small home, there were great, clean mounds of snow lying several feet from the foundation walls, the accumulated evidence of her roof shedding its burden throughout the storm. Her roof itself was almost entirely clear, a dark, damp brown against the brilliant white of the snow. She had not shoveled. She had not risked her life. She had sat by her fire while the house took care of itself. She was safe. Her children were safe. She had consumed less than a quarter of the firewood her neighbors had burned through in a desperate attempt to fight a cold that poured in through their strained and failing structures. Silas had worked for 36 hours straight. His hands were raw, his face was blistered by the wind, and his back felt as though it might break. His own roof had held, but barely. He knew that one more foot of snow would have been the end of it. Exhausted and defeated, his mind kept returning to the impossible image of Ilara's cabin, still standing. He had to see. He had to understand. He pulled on his stiff, frozen boots and began the arduous journey, wading through snow that was waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep. Every step was a monumental effort. He was driven by a confusion so profound, it felt like a physical sickness. Everything he knew, everything he had ever been taught about building, about winter, about survival, had been proven wrong. As he approached her property, he heard it. That same deep rumble, that same powerful whoosh. A fresh layer of snow, accumulated in the final hours of the storm, slid off the roof in a clean, elegant avalanche, landing with a soft thud on the pile below. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth agape. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't luck. It was a system, a working system. He stood there for a long time, watching, the cold air stinging his lungs. The derisive laughter of the past months echoed in his memory, and it tasted like ash. He was wrong. He, the master builder, the man everyone trusted, had been utterly and completely wrong. The foolish widow was not foolish at all. She was a genius. He finally made his way to her door, his pride a heavy weight, heavier than any snow. He knocked, a hesitant, humbled sound. The door opened, and Alara stood there, her expression calm, her eyes clear. Behind her, he could see her children playing on the floor, bathed in the warm light of the hearth. The air that flowed out of the cabin was not the superheated, dry air of a home with a raging fire, but a gentle, steady warmth. It was a warmth that felt impossible in this frozen world. He could not find the words. He just stared into the impossible peace of her home. He saw no signs of a struggle, no exhaustion, no fear. He saw only a quiet, well-ordered life that had passed through the crucible of the storm untouched. His own home was a disaster zone of spilled water, wet clothes, and frayed nerves. Alara did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." Her victory was as quiet and unassuming as she was. She simply stepped aside. "You look cold, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "Come in. There is coffee on the stove." He stumbled inside, removing his snow-caked hat. The warmth enveloped him like a blanket. He sat at her small table, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug she offered. He looked up at the ceiling, at the smooth, packed earth above the simple wooden planks. There were no drips. There were no groans. There was only a profound, unshakable solidity. "How?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "The earth holds the heat from the house," she explained simply, as if discussing the weather. "Just a little. It keeps the snow from freezing to the surface. The weight of the snow becomes its own enemy. It pushes itself off." She looked at him, her gaze direct but without judgment. "You cannot fight a mountain, Silas. You can only show it a better way down." In that moment, Silas understood. He understood the elegance of it, the profound wisdom. They had all been fighting the winter with brute force, with bigger beams and more nails, a battle of strength against strength. Alara had used intelligence. She had used observation. She had listened to the forces of nature instead of shouting at them. Her humility had been her greatest tool. News of what Silas had seen spread through the settlement like wildfire. It had to. In the aftermath of the storm, the community was a wreck. Several families had to move in with neighbors after their roofs had partially collapsed. The shared crisis broke down the walls of pride and skepticism. One by one, then in small groups, people made the same pilgrimage Silas had made, wading through the deep snow to the widow's cabin. They came to stare at the clear roof and the great piles of shed snow. They saw the proof with their own eyes. The laughter was gone, replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. The boys who had taunted her now looked at the ground, ashamed. The women who had pitied her now looked at her with a new and profound admiration. They would peer inside her cabin, marveling at the calm warmth. They saw her children, healthy and safe, and they looked back at their own, who were recovering from days spent huddled in drafty, dangerous homes. The evidence was irrefutable. Her way was better. A few days later, Silas returned. This time, he did not come alone. He brought with him the 5 other senior builders of the settlement, men of his own generation, men steeped in the same traditions he was. They stood before her on her doorstep, their hats in their hands, their faces grim with the weight of their newfound humility. The collective pride of the settlement's builders stood humbled before the quiet widow. It was Silas who spoke, his voice clear and stripped of all its former arrogance. "Ilara," he said, meeting her eyes, "we were wrong. We were fools. We let our pride blind us to your wisdom." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Teach us." The other men nodded in silent, solemn agreement. It was a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire community. It was an admission that their way, the way of their fathers, was no longer enough. It was an act of surrender to a better idea. Ilara did not hesitate. She invited them in, cleared her small table, and unrolled the original diagrams her father had sent her so many years ago. She held nothing back. She explained the principles of thermal mass, of insulation, of calculating the precise pitch. She spoke of the importance of the waterproof membrane, of the exact composition of the earthen mixture. She answered every question with patience and clarity. She drew new diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick to illustrate her points, showing them how the forces of weight and friction worked in harmony. She was not a victor lecturing the defeated. She was a teacher sharing essential knowledge, a neighbor helping her neighbors survive. They listened with rapt attention, their skepticism replaced by the focused intensity of true students. They, who had worked with wood their entire lives, were now learning the secrets of the earth. That spring, as the last of the great snows melted and the valley turned green again, a new sound filled the air. It was the sound of rebuilding, but it was a different kind of building. All across the settlement, old roofs were being torn off. Under the direction of Silas, who had become Ilara's most dedicated student, the community worked together. They hauled clay from the hillside, gravel from the creek, and soil from the riverbank. They followed Ilara's instructions to the letter, measuring angles with a precision they had never before bothered with, carefully laying the membranes of bark and tarred canvas. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The steep, shingled roofs that had defined their architecture for generations were replaced by the gentle, sod-covered slopes of Ilara's design. The cabins began to look as though they were growing out of the earth itself, becoming a part of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. By the time autumn arrived, nearly every home in the valley had a living, breathing, earthen roof. The next winter came, and it was as harsh as the one before. But this time, there was no fear. There was no desperate, dangerous shoveling. Throughout the settlement, as the snows fell, a new sound became part of the winter symphony. The low, deep rumble and the satisfying whoosh of roofs shedding their burdens. The cabins were warmer, quieter, and safer than they had ever been. The woodpiles lasted longer. The children slept soundly. The community had not just adopted a new building technique, they had adopted a new philosophy. The story of the widow's roof spread. Trappers and surveyors passing through the valley saw the strange, effective structures and carried the tale to other settlements in the territory. Men would travel for days to see the roofs for themselves and to speak with Silas, who always gave full credit to the quiet woman who had taught him. The idea, born from an engineer's letter and a widow's quiet determination, rippled outward, a legacy of shared wisdom. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She remained a quiet member of the community, her contribution woven into the very fabric of their homes, a silent testament to her vision. Years later, travelers would remark that the people of that valley had a different kind of wisdom in their eyes. They had learned a profound lesson, a lesson that went far beyond the art of building. They had learned that the loudest voice is not always the wisest. They had learned that tradition, without observation, can become a cage. And they had learned that true strength is not found in fighting nature with brute force, but in understanding it with a humble heart. The greatest structures they built were not their cabins, but the community itself, rebuilt on a foundation of humility and a deep respect for the quiet genius who had taught them how to listen to the earth. This story reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come not from a thunderous declaration, but from a quiet observation. It teaches that wisdom often resides where we least expect it, and that the courage to challenge convention, even in the face of mockery, can protect and preserve a community for generations. The greatest strength is not in resisting the storm, but in learning its language and designing a way to let it pass by harmlessly. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet wisdom and unconventional thinking. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.